So take a look at this first image. This is a map of the Roman world around 117 AD. It depicts the high water mark of Roman expansion. You can see the Roman Empire basically surrounded the entire Mediterranean. Here you can see their occupation in places as far-flung as North Africa, the Holy Land, Turkey, Spain, France, Germany, of course Italy, and even up into Great Britain. This map to me demonstrates the indelible mark of Rome on this part of the world. And even in places in Western Europe, you can still go and see Roman ruins in France and Spain and England. The city of London was founded by the Romans. They had a real knack for locating a great town or great site for a town or city, a place where there was plentiful water, good sunlight, good place to grow crops, that sort of thing. So many cities in Europe today are located at places where the Romans themselves founded settlements. Not only that, but Roman roads connected this entire empire. This idea of all roads leading to Rome is pretty accurate. And even today, the width of railroad tracks and roads and that sort of thing have their origins in Roman standards and measurements. So how did this massive empire get started? Well, it had pretty humble origins, a small village on the banks of the river Tiber. There's a very interesting and fun story about the actual founding of that village on the Tiber River. It goes back to a couple of twin brothers who were born, and after they were born, they were recognized as a threat to power. A servant was dispatched to kill them. The servant couldn't bring himself to kill them, so he released them into the wild. These two brothers, one of whose name was Romulus and the other named Remus, grew up as feral children, according to the story. They were nursed by a wolf, and that's what this sculpture depicts. And they grew up, and Romulus ended up killing Remus and founding Rome, and that's why Rome shares his name. That's why it's not called Rheims. It's named after Romulus. Interesting story, as yet uncorroborated by history, but a story that very much has a hold on the Italian imagination. This sculpture of Romulus and Remus being nursed by the she-wolf is called the Capitoline Wolf. It's a very famous sculpture, and there's some dispute about how old it is. I'm not going to get into it now, but it's iconic. This image is one that you see actually emblazoned on the manhole covers of Rome even today, and you can go all over Italy and see this image of the Capitoline Wolf. So very famous, and also with disputed origins, showing an inauspicious beginning to a grand and expansive empire. Now let's talk about how the Romans were different from the Greeks. While the Greeks sort of had their heads in the clouds, they were really into idealized beauty and aesthetic perfection. The Romans were more practical. They were pragmatists, tended to be organizers, engineers, and architects on a very grand scale, certainly more so than the Greeks. Now, in spite of this difference in mindset, the Romans did sort of go crazy over Greek art. Much of their own art they copied and assimilated from the Greeks. This dates back to 211 BC when a Roman general named Marcellus came back from the Greek city of Syracuse and brought all of these sculptures. And Rome totally fell in love with this Greek artwork. In fact, there was a poet, the poet Horace, said that captive Greece took her rude captor captive. In other words, even though the Romans conquered Greece, Greece sort of culturally conquered Rome. So a lot of Roman sculpture has its origins in Greek sculpture because of this adoration of Greek culture. But before we get into Roman sculpture and how that was influenced by the Greeks, let's talk about some of the things the Romans really specialized in. Again, the Romans are very practical, and because of that, they're really good at engineering and architectural projects on a big scale. And some of their biggest contributions to the world have been in the areas of civil engineering. So let's look at some unique Roman contributions to architecture. Let's start with the arch. For most of the history of the world before Rome comes along, the main way of creating structures and buildings, and especially entrances and doors and windows, is something called a post and lintel. This is an architectural construction we've already seen at Stonehenge, consisting of two vertical posts that are capped by a lintel stone on the top. Again, just think of those trilithons at Stonehenge, those three rock sort of constructions. And this is how most houses and dwellings were built. And it's okay, it's pretty good, but you can't put a whole lot of weight on top of it because that horizontal lintel stone will eventually crack and collapse. So the Romans designed the arch to rectify this problem. And you can see in this next image, we have a photograph of an arch that is a part of an ancient Roman city, and a lot of the walls around it have collapsed. A lot of the buildings have crumbled, but the arch still stands. And this picture is a perfect testimony to the strength of the arch, built of interlocking wedge-shaped stones that, as you put weight on top of it, only get tighter. They only get more locked together. It's immensely strong. And in many ways, you could say the history of architecture is people figuring out ways to support the weight of walls and a roof. And that's something the arch does really well. And the arch works so well, in fact, that the Romans create some variations on the arch that they use in different building projects. One is called the barrel vault. And you can see a picture of that. This is simply an arch that has been sort of extruded or stretched out into a long tunnel. And this allows the Romans to create really high arched ceilings that run for long ways down the length of a building. Or it might allow them to create a tunnel through a really thick stone wall. Now you take two barrel vaults and you cross them at 90-degree angles and you have something called a groin vault. There's also a picture of that, and you can see that's sort of this cross-shaped affair that allows a really large interior space where these two barrel vaults intersect. So the arch and its relatives are a really big deal, and we're going to see those a lot in Roman architecture. Another very important Roman contribution to engineering is concrete. The Romans basically invent concrete, and no longer do they have to cut stones like we saw with the Egyptians, for example. Now they can create molds, and they can pour this basically liquid rock into whatever mold they want and cast it into any shape they want. So the Romans are going to use that to marvelous effect in some of the buildings we're going to look at. They even formulate a concrete mixture that will harden and set up underwater. This allows them to have very strong foundations for piers that reach out into the ocean, for example, or bridges. So that's still a really amazing thing, concrete that hardens underwater. Let's look at a great example of the Romans applying the arch. This is in an aqueduct. It's a very famous aqueduct in France called the Pont du Gard. Remember, the Romans are not just in Italy, they're also in Western Europe. So it's pretty cool to see a Roman aqueduct in France. And this is certainly one of the most famous and best preserved portions of a Roman aqueduct in the world. And what we see here is, remember, just a portion of the aqueduct. The total aqueduct is 31 miles long. It carries water, or carried water, from a spring in the mountains 31 miles to the city of Nîmes, France. So this, and of course, this is what aqueducts are for. Romans created these basically highways for water to supply their cities with a constant source of fresh water that arrives in the city under pressure. Basically, it's a long ramp. The water flows downhill for many, many miles, and when it arrives in the city, it has some force behind it, and that can be used, of course, to power fountains, to create basically flushing toilets, and a sewer system. So this is a really amazing engineering project. And the piece we're looking at is simply the piece that crosses the Gard River in France. And you have a really great view of it at this crossing. Now, the amazing thing is, this aqueduct descends over its 31-mile length a vertical distance of only 56 feet. So it gradually slopes downward, little by little, which must have been an incredibly hard thing to manage for the Romans, but they did it, and they did it all over the world where they had aqueducts. Notice the repeated arch motif in this part of the aqueduct, supporting the weight of the masonry and the water. Another amazing fact about the Pont du Gard is that it is built without mortar. It's what we call dry stone construction. Stones are essentially stacked together with nothing gluing them together. And for many years, it was sort of a rite of passage for stonemasons to come and visit the Pont du Gard and study the stonework. The next Roman building I want to look at is arguably the most famous, also making use of the arch again and again. Also, a celebration of concrete. There's a lot of concrete that was used in the construction of this, and this, of course, is the Colosseum. This is really the defining building that many people think of when they think of Rome. It was built as essentially a PR project in the 70s AD. Before it was built, the Emperor Nero, who of course was mean and crazy and all those things that you've heard about him, had built a villa on this site. He'd built a personal house for himself on this site in Rome, and it had been public land before, and he seized it for himself, and he created an artificial lake and also a really large statue of himself called the Colossus of Nero. After Nero come a dynasty of emperors called the Flavian dynasty, and these emperors, including the Emperor Vespasian, I think he was the one who started it, said, you know, this is really bad. Nobody really liked Nero. There were big problems with him stealing public land to make his house. Let's engage in a massive PR project by reclaiming this land for the Roman people. So they took out the villa and decided to create a place basically for public entertainment, spectacles, and games, and that was, of course, the Colosseum. So here's a picture of the Colosseum. Ancient Rome's biggest PR project, probably derives its name from the Colossus of Nero that used to stand there. And this is basically the archetype for all our sports arenas. The whole concept of a performance space in the round comes from the Colosseum, and all of our contemporary sports stadiums, football stadiums especially, can be traced back to this famous structure in Rome, which is also known, by the way, as the Flavian Amphitheater, after the family of emperors who built it. When it was finally finished, according to the story, it was supposedly inaugurated with 100 days of games. And these games, of course, would include everything from animal hunts. Animals would be released on the floor of the Colosseum amongst artificial scenery, mimicking a forest perhaps, and they would be hunted. There might be public executions that happened at the Colosseum. Sometimes condemned criminals were dressed as heroes from classical mythology, heroes who, of course, died in the stories, and these people would actually be killed, sort of reenacting the myths of ancient Rome. There were, of course, most famously, human-on-human gladiator games that happened. So a lot of blood is shed in the Colosseum, and not all of it is human blood. A lot of animals were killed here too. Before we go inside the Colosseum, let's look at the exterior. You can see there are three levels or courses of arches, and if you look really closely in this first image, you can see the columns. On the bottom level, we have Doric columns. On the middle level, Ionic columns. On the third level, Corinthian columns. So the three Greek orders are basically stolen by Rome, and all three are incorporated in the Colosseum, kind of in an ascending order. This next image contains both an overhead shot of how the Colosseum ruins look today, kind of skeletal, and on the right-hand side, there's a little model of the Colosseum and how it actually looked back in the 70s and 80s. Now, the Colosseum is not just like a mass of solid concrete. It is penetrated by passageways and exit ramps. Below the floor of the Colosseum was a labyrinth of storage rooms and waiting places for animals and gladiators. There was also very complicated machinery that would raise combatants up to the level of the floor. So this exploded diagram that we see gives you a little idea of what it was like. The whole idea of crowd control in a sports stadium comes from the Colosseum. People would come in and they would have a seat number that was written on a little clay shard, and they would go to their seat. There were passageways and exits that allowed the Colosseum to be emptied very quickly in case of an emergency or riot or something like that. Around the upper border of the Colosseum, you see again in this exploded diagram, are these vertical posts. And these posts once helped support a cloth awning that stretched part of the way across the Colosseum. It was actually manned by Roman sailors who were used to climbing around in the rigging of ships. And they would pull this cloth canvas out over the crowd, partially, it didn't cover the whole thing, to protect them from the elements, from the sun and the rain. This canopy was called a velarium. So something a lot of people don't realize about the Colosseum is that it initially had a sort of roof, which is a handy thing if you want to keep 50,000 spectators happy. And that is actually the capacity of the Colosseum originally. That is a lot of people. But again, keep in mind, the Colosseum is a big PR move on the part of Roman emperors to get in the good graces of the people. And it certainly was an exciting and awful place all at the same time. A place where the most bloodthirsty instincts of humanity were satisfied. One of the fun facts about the Colosseum is that at the end of the 100 days of inaugural games, according to some historians, the bottom of the floor of the Colosseum was flooded with water, and ships were brought in, and there were sea battles, people ramming each other and fighting each other and maybe even shooting like flaming arrows. Somehow they were able to waterproof the bottom of it and actually fill it with water and conduct these naval battles. Other historians dispute this is possible, but it's a pretty interesting idea. This next image shows the interior of the Colosseum. You can see where the seats used to be. For a long time, the Colosseum served as a quarry, and a lot of the original seating, the original marble seating, was removed for building projects. So what we have remaining is a skeleton. But you can see in this picture at the bottom of the Colosseum, this is the area that I told you about earlier, the underground rooms and storage areas where gladiators and animals would wait to be brought up to the surface through a complex system of elevators and pulleys and trapdoors. The original floor level of the Colosseum, you can see in the lower right of the photo, marked with kind of a orange border, and everything is below it. For a long time, plants have been growing in this lower level of the Colosseum, and there are some romantic theories about how the plants got there. It's a unique ecosystem that exists in this combination nowhere else in the world. It's a really unusual mixture of plants, and many have the romantic idea that these plants arrived here in the bellies of the animals who were hunted and killed on the floor of the Colosseum. So that's kind of a tantalizing thought. But a lot of botanists have studied the plant life of the Colosseum. Pretty cool. This next image shows us what a typical scene in the Colosseum might have looked like. This is a painting from the 1870s by Jean-Léon Gérôme. It shows some gladiators who have just engaged in battle on the floor of the Colosseum. By the way, the floor was actually covered in sand so that if somebody bled on it, you could sort of rake the sand over the blood. So we see that illustrated in this painting. A gladiator has just conquered a foe and places his foot on the man's neck. He looks up to the crowd to see whether or not he should kill this man. The man, on the other hand, the poor guy who was fighting with a trident and a net, you can see those on the ground, appeals to the crowd for mercy. Apparently, though, The crowd is not in a mood to grant mercy. You can see they are giving the thumbs down. The emperor himself, Caesar, has apparently deferred the decision to the crowd. You can see him in the royal box there towards the left-hand side of the painting. The name of this painting is Pollice Verso, or thumbs down. So it looks like this poor man is about to meet a gory end on the floor of the Colosseum. This is a pretty accurate painting in terms of research. Jerome went to museums and he studied actual gladiator gear left over from ancient Rome. He got the architectural ornaments right. And he even got the shadows from the cloth awning, the velarium, correct on most of this painting. You can see there are little spears or shafts of light. Those are from slits in between pieces of the velarium awning. And you can see other parts of the Colosseum in the background bathed in sunlight. So this is what a gladiator combat may have looked like in the Colosseum. And this particular painting was also inspiration for Ridley Scott. When he made his Gladiator movie, he was very much inspired by the drama of this painting. Moving on to another building in ancient Rome that makes good use of concrete, this is the Pantheon. This is one of the best preserved Roman structures in the world. It's in kind of the middle of Rome. It's surrounded by buildings. And it was initially created as a temple for all the gods, making sure that they didn't miss any. And it is a revolutionary building studied by architects all over the world. It consists of a cylindrical interior with a porch on the front. And you can see that in the overhead view, a porch that has a colonnade of Corinthian columns on it. You can see the leaf-like forms at the very top of those columns. But it's an unusual building, and it's pretty cool. The interior, the cylindrical part of the Pantheon, is lit entirely by natural lighting. There's a hole in the top called the oculus that the sun shines through and provides the only light source in the Pantheon. When it rains, rain falls in through that skylight and is distributed down through drain holes in the floor. It's a very cool, impressive structure to go to. If you ever go to Rome, be sure to stop and see the Pantheon. Here's a view of the very dramatic interior with a shaft of light illuminating part of the entrance. And you can see the ceiling is actually a dome. It is what is called a coffered ceiling, or a ceiling that is ornamented with these recesses, these square recesses that move up towards the oculus. And this was done for a couple of reasons, these squarish recesses. One, it looks cool. It's more interesting to look at than just a smooth dome interior. And also, it saves weight. As this dome, which is made of concrete, gets higher and higher, it gets heavier and heavier. So these coffered areas, these recesses, allow less concrete to be used. So it gets lighter and lighter. Also, the Roman engineers changed the mixture of the concrete as they moved closer to the oculus and had lighter stone used in the concrete mixture as we get towards the top. Also, the walls get thinner as well. The Pantheon shows just the great possibilities of concrete. And by the way, don't confuse the Pantheon with the Parthenon. The Pantheon is in Rome, the Parthenon is in Athens. And I know they sound kind of similar, but try to keep them straight in your head. Okay, that's Roman architecture, built to last. Let's look at some Roman sculpture. You can see on this next slide a sampling of different Roman portrait busts. And remember, the Romans fell in love with the Greeks, and a lot of their sculpture is copies of actual Greek sculptures. Not just the style of Greek sculpture, but actual total rip-offs of Greek sculpture. And some of the Greek statues that have been lost to the ages we know about because the Romans made their own versions of them. So look at this image, and it shows kind of a range of Roman styles. On the left, we have a very idealized looking Greekish kind of sculpture. This is of an emperor, and it's what we might expect for someone who's been influenced by the Greeks. There's a certain idealization going on here This guy has very smooth skin. He's not very wrinkled. So this is very Greek influenced. But what the Romans did is add their own twist to Greek sculpture. They went a step further and they made it more harshly realistic. The Romans were not afraid to put wrinkles and sagging jowls and furrowed brows into their sculptures. You can see that in the two images on the right-hand side. This is Roman pragmatism expressed in their sculpture. They didn't really have their heads in the clouds quite as much as the Greeks, and they had no problem sculpting an image of someone as he or her looked. Look at the middle sculpture. This is noteworthy just because it's cool and technically amazing. It's the famous portrait of a Flavian woman, and it's just a Roman upper-class matron. And check out her hairstyle. She has all these hundreds of little ringlets that have been carved out of the marble and drilled out. Just a really amazing feat of sculpture. I mean, even if I just saw this as hair on a woman's head, I would be very impressed. And I'm even more impressed that someone would carve this out of stone. Think of how much more difficult that would be than even to arrange this actual hairstyle. So in these sculptures, we have a great example of how the Roman aesthetic was superimposed on top of the Greek aesthetic and how they added their own kind of twist to statuary. All right, let's move on to Roman painting now. Here we see a wall painting from the Roman city of Pompeii. And although there are some awkward things about this woman, which is a depiction, by the way, of the goddess Venus, awkward things like her back leg, which looks tilted at a weird angle, this is still a pretty big improvement over what we've seen so far. Think about Egyptian wall painting, for example, with its weird composite views of the human body all fused into one, different angles. Think about our Greek vase painting that we saw with these stylized figures, sort of seen from profile. Here on this Roman wall painting, we have a depiction of the human figure that's more convincingly three-dimensional than we've seen so far. This figure actually looks rounded and three-dimensional. Look at her face, for example. That's certainly a big improvement on anything we've looked at up to this point. Now, we actually have Roman painting in places like Pompeii because Pompeii was preserved by a natural disaster. And this was the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. A lot of ancient painting, like the painting that used to cover the Parthenon, for example, has been eroded away. But in the case of Pompeii, we had an entire city that was covered with ash from this volcanic eruption and basically sealed it and made it into a time capsule. So we have preserved some aspects of this Roman seaside city that give us a really great insight into what everyday life was like for the Romans. Now, Pompeii is really interesting to talk about because nowhere else in the world of ancient Rome do we nowadays have a sense of connection with the people who live there as impressively as we do at Pompeii. In part because of its preservation, and in part because of some eerie remnants, some reminders of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. As Pompeii has been excavated for a really long time, and excavations still continue, but as long ago as the 1700s, people were digging around Pompeii trying to figure out what this little town was like. And archaeologists began to notice these cavities. Their shovels would break through the soil into these small openings in the soil. And nobody could figure out what these were until somebody had the grand idea to fill these holes with plaster. And when the plaster was hardened, the dirt around them was taken away. And it was realized that these cavities were places that bodies had been buried and then rotted away. So those casts of victims of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius are still available for people to view in Pompeii. And here are a couple of images of those. And we see people basically in their death throes, covering their mouths, praying, struggling. These are very grim, macabre reminders that real people lived here and people actually died here. It's one of the more remarkable aspects of a visit to Pompeii. It's not art, it's just a tragic reminder of the civilization that produced some of the art that we see in Pompeii. Here's a painting by Karl Brylov from 1833 that imagines what the eruption of Vesuvius was like. And this may be a little over dramatized, but it is certainly an exciting painting. We see people who are already on the ground who've been struck by falling debris. We see other citizens huddled together. We see people fleeing and trying to shield themselves from this rain of debris and ash that's coming down from the mountain. And just so we don't end on such a grim note, I want to close out this examination of Roman art and architecture with a sculpture. It is a massive sculpture, or at least is part of what once was a massive sculpture. This is the colossal head of Constantine. It's from the 300s, and I want you to compare it stylistically to the portrait busts that we looked at earlier. And I want you to ask yourself, what's the difference? What has changed in this sculpture from the latter days of the Roman Empire? And one of the things you might notice is that in many ways it's less realistic. Look at the eyes. The eyes are bulging out. They're huge. They're not very well proportioned in relation to the rest of the face. The style of the sculpture has gone back in some ways to the idealization that we saw earlier. In other words, we don't have all the wrinkles and the furrows and that sort of thing we might see in a real person. So it's this weird mix of idealization and distortion. And something we see beginning around this time is a decline in realism in a lot of art, both in painting and sculpture, that marks the end of the classical era and the beginning of the Middle Ages. So we'll talk a little more about that in our next module when we dive into the medieval period and talk about why this change in realism happened and what its ramifications would be for the artistic world.